So this is a friend of mine in Australia named David Tensen, and it's Tensen. If you want to read what I think are profoundly beautiful poems, davidtensen.com, and Tensen. And I wanted to start with one called A Blessing, but it won't work. But this one's pretty good. It's called Dear Breakdown. When I saw you coming over the horizon, I braced myself.
You were saying.
Yeah, I was.
Please silence Siri.
I know. I had that happen to me at a wedding. And it was, we lived for 17 years in Boring, Oregon. The name of the town is Boring. Yeah, Boring, Boring, Oregon. And then I wrote the shack and we moved to Happy Valley. And there's actually one town in between. In order to get from Boring to Happy Valley, you have to go through Damascus. I'm serious. True story. Yep, it's true. Yep. And we lived in Boring for all those years, and it was the home of the Boring Baptist Church. And they eventually did change their name. And so this is Oregon. Oregon doesn't, we don't do a lot of like standard wedding ceremonies, traditional ones. But this was an Episcopal church in Boring, and it was the Boring Episcopal Church. But we had a traditional wedding there, and it had one of those. And it had been a long time since I'd been in a wedding where they have that time of silence where they say, if anybody here knows any reason why these two shouldn't, have sex legally, I don't know what they say. But so it's like, and then there's this awkward silence, right? And normally we don't do that in Oregon because, we'd be there all night. I've got a reason, so I got 3 reasons, so it's like, But not only did my phone go off during that awkward moment of silence, it went straight to speaker.
Oh, no.
And one of Kim's not quiet sisters, in a booming voice, says, "Hey, Paul, are you still in that silly wedding or what?" And she said my name, so I couldn't go. "Hey, Nicholas, turn your phone off." So it doesn't bother me when a phone goes off. It just lets me tell that story, actually. Dear Breakdown, when I saw you coming over the horizon, I braced myself. With your strong gaze and constant gait, I began to suspect you were on assignment, or I had summoned you unknowingly. I'd seen what you had done to others. Their lives resembled wrecks. Many lost hope and all sense of pride, and you were coming for me now, and I was unprepared. Sure, these people recovered and discovered they couldn't arrange galaxies with their false personas. But who wants to go through hell for that lesson? And some claimed they loved deeper and laughed louder and found their true selves. But who wants to submit to your painful ways? So much in me told me you were not welcome. Too many memories of failing and falling had me questioning your nearness once more. But then you had your way. I expected you to hit and run, but you were more committed than that. I had you all wrong. Sure, it hurt, and sure, I died many deaths, but you allowed me to see that I was never in charge, never that strong, never going to wake up to the presence of all things unless you came to my rescue. So thank you, Breakdown. Isn't that tender? Scary, yeah. Religious people believe in hell, and spiritual people have been there. So there is this element of the burning away of our lives. A couple years ago, 3, I think now, I was going to Nashville, and I was speaking to like 600 millennials out on Johnny Cash's old farmhouse. and that had been bought. It was the craziest thing. I go into Johnny Cash's old farmhouse, and it's got all kinds of memorabilia up, and I look in the library, and it's littered with first edition George MacDonald books. I mean, it's just like, what? And I found out that the new owner had gone all over Europe buying George MacDonald books because he just loved them. And before I left, he gave me 2 first edition George MacDonald books. But a friend of mine heard, this afternoon I told a story about a friend named Tony, but Tony Woodall. And Tony lives in Nashville. And Tony has a son, and Tony's son is in early 20s, but he should have been born in like the 1970s. He's sort of a hippie in the wrong century. And he got in trouble with the law. And what he did, one of his really good friends works at an exotic pet store. And Tony's son just got so perturbed about this exotic pet store that he broke in one night and freed all the animals. So you had pythons racing around Murfreesboro and outside of Nashville, and cockatoos and all kinds of critters, right? Well, it turns out that that's a felony. And he was sentenced to 18 months in federal penitentiary. And he's a tender soul, and it was really hard on him. And so he serves his time, and his dad, he loves his dad, and his dad was a pastor for 35 years in a very conservative environment before beginning to make changes about how he thought about things. And his dad, Tony, had come down to visit Baxter Kruger in Jackson, Mississippi. And Baxter has this little guys gathering every year, and there's one coming up at the end of May in near Memphis. What town is it in? Jackson, Tennessee. Yeah, that one's in Jackson, Tennessee, but he lives in Jackson, Mississippi. He's got a lot of history in Mississippi. His grandfather was the first judge and was a doctor in the county near Prescott. No. Anyway, he had the first phone. His number was 1. Can you imagine having the number 1? Yeah. So Baxter has his guys gathering. So Tony goes down to see Baxter and have his world shaken a bit. And I'm there. I happen to be there. Most of the time I'm not there because he always plans it around my birthday, and I'm sorry, I'm home. And so, but this one was off of my birthday enough that I was there. And so I meet Tony, and we strike up a conversation and stuff like that. So Tony is leaving Jackson, Mississippi, and gets a phone call from his son, who is now out of prison. And his son says, "Dad, where are you?" He says, I'm down in Jackson, Mississippi. I drove down here to visit a theologian named Baxter Kruger, and tells him about the weekend. He says, "Oh, and by the way, I met this author. I think you'd like his work. His name is Paul Young. He wrote a book called The Shack." And his son bursts into tears on the other end of the phone. And Tony's like, "What?" And he said, "Dad, I've been meaning to tell you that the day I bought the gun to kill myself, someone handed me a copy of The Shack. It saved my life." So I'm sure you're like me about this. If somebody's kind to me, I'm grateful. But if they're kind to my children, they're kind of mine forever, There is something about the way that someone will relate to my children or my grandchildren. It's to me one of the deepest gifts that anybody can absolutely give, because there are things that you cannot communicate to your children that they can hear it. But when somebody else does, and using almost exactly the same words, and it gets through, you're like, "Yes, thank you so much," And but just kindness, just relating to them as human beings and all that. So I'm Tony's forever, and because of this little interchange. So Tony knew I was coming to speak to the millennials out at Johnny Cash's place. Tony's got a friend named David. David works for Vanderbilt. And David, his life was in a wreck, was in a free fall. And David, he didn't know what to do about he was sliding into depression, and it was verging on potential suicide. And somebody came up to him and gave him really good advice. And that is, instead of thinking about yourself 24/7, why don't you do something for somebody else? Right? And he goes like, okay. And he looks around, who do I identify with? And he decided that he most identified with the guys on death row at the maximum security penitentiary in Nashville. And so he goes in and he meets a man named Terry King. And Terry King at that time had been on death row for 33 years. He was an 18-year-old and he shot a young man, and he was drunk and high, and he shot the young man who was also in the military. And so he got sentenced to death. And he'd been going through the appeal process. And but David goes in to meet Terry, and turns out that Terry was one of the freest people that David had ever met. The first time I talked to David about this, he said, Paul, I went in there thinking that I might be able to do something for them. No. He said, those guys know more about who they are than almost anybody I've ever met. And they have changed my life, right? So David hears from Tony that I'm coming to town, and one of the things that Terry had told him was that the shack had changed his life, because the shack is going through all kinds of prisons and on death row and all of that. And so David says to Tony, do you think that Paul would come and spend some time with Terry? And Tony says, of course he will, right? And then he calls me and tells me that I'm going to. And I said, yeah, he knew me well enough at this point to know that, yeah, are you kidding? Like, that's so beautiful. I would love to do that. So I went in, and the first time that I went in, I spent about 2.5 hours with Terry, and also his friend Ron, who'd been on death row for 30 years. And I'm telling you, I have rarely in my life been with healthier or more free people than the guys that I've met on death row. And we talked about that. And I said, I think part of this is that your prison is obvious. I mean, it's so obvious that it gives you a huge amount of clarity. But all the millions of billions of us out there that are running around in our own prisons, we don't see them. They're not so obvious. And therefore, we just keep running. And they were telling me how, Ron says to me, he says, you know what I can't remember that I would love to do? And I said, what's that? He said, step on grass. He said, I haven't stepped on grass in 30 years. All we have is concrete and tile, and we have rocks in the yard. And so, it must be so great to step on something that sort of springs back like that, And then Ron says, oh, one night Terry and the guards forgot about us, and we were out in the yard. And I said, maybe we should tell them. and Terry says, nah, they'll figure it out. And he says, we got to be out there and the stars came out. And it was a clear Tennessee night. And all of a sudden the Milky Way, and all we did is stood there in just awe of what was right there. And had been there, but we couldn't see it. And as they talk, tears, just. And I'd sit there, and Terry, he'd talk, and then he'd stop, and he'd reach over, and he'd touch my shoulder, and he'd start to cry. And he'd say, you're here. Why are you here? And I said, it's because God loves me. That's why I'm here. And he'd go like, your book changed my life. I said, yeah, tell me about that. He said, well, it was the cave scene with Sophia. And how many of you have seen the movie? Okay, a fair bit of you, and read the book? Okay. So for those of you who haven't, Mackenzie is a man whose youngest daughter has been brutally kidnapped and murdered. And evidence is found in a shack that she has been killed, but they don't find her body. And so he goes into what's called the Great Sadness. And I wrote the book for my kids. I wrote a book about murder and stuff for my kids, and people go like, how could you do that? And I go like, well, it was my wife who said, someday would you just write something as a gift for our kids that puts in one place how you think, because you think outside the box. That was the mandate. And I hadn't felt healthy enough to do it until the year I turned 50 for a lot of reasons. Mackenzie spends a weekend in the shack, which really is representative of his own broken heart and his own broken soul. It's the house on the inside that people helped him build. And he didn't get good help. And I'm Mackenzie, but I'm also Missy. I'm also the little girl. I had a writer from Nashville, actually, who wrote me when the book first came out and said, I don't know you or anything about you, because at that time nobody did. I don't know you, but my sense is that Missy represents something murdered in you as a child, probably your innocence. And Mackenzie is you as an adult trying to deal with that. I showed it to Kim, my wife, and she goes, boy, she nailed it. Because sexual abuse was a big part of my childhood, both in the tribal culture. I'm a missionary kid. And then at 6, I was sent away to boarding school, and the big boys would come at night. And I would exchange the potential to belong somewhere for what they required, And so Missy's the child that got broken and lost, and then Mackenzie is the adult trying to deal with it. So Mackenzie's weekend in the shack, coming back to his own brokenness and beginning to deal with the brokenness of his own soul, which had to do with his dad, my dad, who was a very violent disciplinarian, and because I didn't know, because his dad was, and his dad before him was, but I didn't know that as a child. I just knew that he was terrifying. And so he comes back, he spends a weekend that represents an 11-year process of unwinding the brokenness of my own soul. And when I wrote the book, I was the year I turned 50. And it was really I didn't know that this journey of dealing with the brokenness of my own heart, that would be an 11-year process for me to do major construction work. It's not like it's all done, but the big chunks and big pieces, like tearing out, all the framing and going down to the studs and finding all the cracks in the basement floors and, and just rebuilding from scratch. Well, when you're in that journey, sometimes it feels like it's going to be forever, like 2 or 3 times forever. And but 11 years, and it was like a switch flipped. And the year I'm turning 50, I finally realized I'm finally one of the healthiest people that I know. And the fact that I know myself is kind of a miracle. But I had no addictions. I had no secrets. Those went away at the beginning of the 11 years. That was part of the big cost to do the work, was to divest myself of all secrets. And that almost blew up everything in my life. Because, when you hate the shack, when you hate your own heart and your own brokenness, you become a performer. You build a facade that you can paint as fast as you can pick up people's expectations. And it's not like you're trying to be fake, you're trying to be good. But it's all a cover-up, because everything in your life has told you you're not. And I'm not just talking about my dad and about abuse. I'm talking about God and my theology that told me the same thing as that the world had told me. Or the guys at the boarding school, or the not belonging, or the bullying, or the coming back to Canada and finding out I didn't know how to function in this world, and I hid in performance, So you become a different thing to every person. And now I'm turning 50, and finally I'm the same person in every situation. Like, how is that even possible? I didn't see that coming. But finally I'm comfortable inside my own skin, and joy had become a constant companion. And I finally was able to live like a child for the first time in my life. I'd never been one. Not that I could remember. And getting there was hell. And there was therapy involved and letting people into my life, which I didn't want to do because my whole world was about staying safe, and people, especially men, were the biggest perpetrators of the abuse. And to learn how to let men into this world, my inside world, I mean, slow, incremental journey. And now I'm 50 and I finally feel healthy. And Kim's the one that's been saying for 4 years, write something as a gift for the kids. And I wrote my whole life. I wrote songs and poetry, and, early stuff was all dark and I burnt it all up. And when I was real younger, I burnt it up because I couldn't take the risk my dad might find it. And then over the years, as I began to deal with stuff, I turned writing into gifts, poetry and songs and short stories and stuff. So Kim liked my writing. My friends did too, but they're my friends and my family. And so you don't think beyond that. I mean, it's like, because that's who you write for. And so I finally felt healthy enough to do this. And I was working 3 jobs, and one of them, I had 40 minutes each way on the train, and so I could jump the train and had 40 minutes to work on a Christmas present for my kids. I was going to write whatever this was. I'm writing on the train, and I'm thinking, I'm starting to write these conversations, the questions that I had growing up as a modern evangelical missionary kid, preacher's kid, all about the goodness of God and about tragedy. And I start writing about conversations. And it turns out, and I hadn't known this really before this, because I'd written in poetic style, but now I'm writing conversations. And suddenly these conversations they became living. I can't hardly write fast enough for the conversations. And turns out I can really write conversations. And it's one of the easiest ways for me to talk to God. And because I'm learning stuff as I'm writing, it's like, wow, that's cool. And that's part of the beauty of writing fiction anyway, is you get to create space. And the space you make it's bigger than what it looks like. So the inside space is bigger than the outside space. That's a C.S. Lewis idea, but it's really true. And when you write even fairly decent fiction, you're creating more space than it uses, and that space is respectful to the person who reads or listens. It allows them to hear for themselves. That's different than nonfiction. Nonfiction, I'm trying to get you to hear what I'm thinking, in my way. But fiction allows a whole bunch of things to happen that you're not in control of, which I love. Plus, in the journey of writing fiction, you don't know where you're going. So I started with the conversations, and the conversations became these, I'm writing them on the backs of grocery bags, as we're in line. I'm like, wow. So I'm writing on the train and I'm looking up and I think, oh, I could write these for my kids and say Conversations with God. And right then I look up and we're going past a movie marquee and it says Conversations with God. I didn't know somebody already wrote the book and turned it into a movie. So oh well, there goes that, and I'm thinking all right, so I'm going to write a story because every human being is a story. My kids love story. So who's asking the question and why? And that's where Mackenzie came from. Mackenzie Allen Phillips spells map, M-A-P. Melissa Ann Phillips spells map, M-A-P, on purpose, so that I can intertwine the two of them together, right? Because I'm both. And then comes the loss. And I had to make a decision. I'm writing this for Christmas. My youngest is 12 years old at the time. And it's there's a 13-year gap, so the oldest is 25, but the youngest is 12. And I'm like, how do I do this? And I decide that I'm going to go this deep because it asks the best questions, because it's the greatest loss. And the psychologists and the sociologists, they agree with me about this. The greatest loss a human being can experience is the loss between a parent and a child, or a grandparent and a grandchild. There is just something about that connection that goes to the deepest places. And so I'm so glad that I look back and I see that as the prompting of the Holy Spirit, even though it's like, boo, that's a little rough. But it really does ask the best questions. When you have a loss like this that is absolutely in violation, where is God? Why does God allow this to happen? How come that we can now trust God if this is what happens, And so it's a huge loss. So I write a story for my kids, and I weave this. It's not graphic, but it's wrenching. And I didn't realize how wrenching it was until people who have had losses began to read it. And I've had people who were Stephen King or horror fans and could read that genre and have no problem at all, couldn't handle The Shack, even though it's never graphic. It's because it is so human, and the loss is real, and the questions are real. And so I write this story, and as I'm writing it, it takes on a life of its own. I'm following the characters, right? It's like, okay, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Papa was a large black African-American woman right from day one, because I'm modern evangelical fundamentalist. I grew up with Gandalf with a bad attitude God. And I'm like trying to get as far away from that omni-being, faceless, nameless omni-being behind Jesus. Because that God wasn't helpful and was abusive like my dad. I mean, even our theology matched my experience with my dad, where, God would beat the hell out of his son in order to be right with other people, So my dad would do the same thing. And except I wasn't innocent, of course, but Jesus was. And so it's just like, how confusing is that? And so I start writing this, and it begins to pick up this sense of wonder. I had a day where I had a Saturday off. I was working 3 jobs. I was doing shipping and receiving. I was cleaning toilets. I was doing web conferencing on the side and working in a hotline for a food processing company. And it was a time where we had nothing. We were living in a little 900 square feet rental house, and 4 of the 6 kids were still home. So we had 2 little bedrooms upstairs with a very small bathroom and a kitchen. And then out of the really rough basement, we created a make-believe bedroom down there for the boys. And then Kim walked 2.5 blocks down to Gresham High School and started bringing kids home from high school to fill in all of our extra space in our 900 square feet. But we entered a period of time, in my 11th year, the last major fear that I encountered, which means that it was the deepest one that I encountered, right? And one that was connected to so much else, was the fear of financial insecurity. It took me 11 years to get that deep. And I realized that how much money gave me a sense of control and kept me from learning how to trust. And it was such a substitute, and it had always been that. And there's a wild, crazy story about how I dealt with that in my 11th year. So we ended up losing the home that we lived in for 17 years. That was part of the healing process. If you have a fear of financial insecurity, there's nothing like losing everything to help heal you. It's like suddenly it's for real, And then you find out, so I was afraid of this? Really? Because most of fear is imagination. And because you even imagine, how badly you're going to feel about this. And it just compounds itself. And then, and we entered a period of time where we learned that the opposite of more is not less. The opposite of more is enough. That's true opposite. They're on totally different scales. And we had been surrounded by enough our entire lives and didn't know it, because we never stayed present to enjoy it. We were always afraid of the next catastrophe. So we were constantly creating imaginations that didn't exist. and we weren't present. So joy was never a constant companion, not because joy had ever left. Joy never left. I left, right? I'd leave the presence to go try to control the universe so that the things I was afraid of didn't happen, even if I did it only in my own head. And so we entered 2.5 years, we lived in that little tiny house. And my kids would say to you, and Kim would, and I would, that those 2.5 years are among the best years of our lives. And we had nothing. And it's crazy, but that period of time destroyed that fear. And also, we were living there when I wrote The Shack. Got it done for Christmas, made my 15 copies at Office Depot that did everything I wanted it to do, and went back to work. I was finally, no secrets, no addictions, content. Content. We had nothing, because contentment has nothing to do with circumstance, like joy doesn't either. Happiness does. Hap is Old English. Hap, luck. So if you're unlucky, you're unhappy. And if you're lucky, you're happy, because it's happenstance, it's luck. But joy is this grounding in shalom, grounding in the peace of God that passes understanding. It's like terrible things can be going on, and yet this river is just there, and you know that it's there all the time, right? Because you're there. And it happens because in the presence is fullness of joy, right? And then that's what becomes your strength, is this joy. So joy had become a constant companion. No addictions, no secrets, same person in all situations, finally a child. And now I felt healthy enough to write the story, so I did. So that was a day, I had a Saturday off. Kim had the kids somewhere, and in 4 hours, I wrote 4 complete chapters, including Festival of Friends, which is the colored lights chapter and the reconciliation with the Father, that whole, and in 8.5 hours, I wrote 4 complete chapters. Festival of Friends is the only chapter in the book never touched by a rewrite. It is in the book the way I wrote it that day, right? It just was like, Kim comes home and says, "What happened to you?" I'd not even left the house, right? "What happened to you?" Because I looked like I was beaten up. And I said, "Well, I stepped out the back of the house and into a river, and it swept me downstream for 25 miles and spat me out naked and bleeding." That's the only way I could describe it, And so it was, writing The Shack was like that. I wrote it in 6 months working 3 jobs. But the hard part was the 50 years building up to the point that I could write it. And when people ask me, how long did it take to write it, I say 50 years. Once I put pen to paper, it was 6 months. And so in the course of writing it, really beautiful things happened. And I'd let some of my friends read it, and they'd give me feedback, and I'd try some of the changes if they thought, "Well, what about this, or what about that?" And some of it worked and some of it didn't. But things happen, like there's a scene in which, and in the movie, the bird is outside on a tree and they have a conversation about it. But in the book, the bird flies onto the windowsill of the kitchen while they're in the kitchen doing stuff. And I'm writing this, right? I'm the author, huh? So I'm writing this, and all of a sudden I write a bird flies in and lands on the windowsill, and I'm going like, why? Right? I'm going, and it's kind of like, well, you wrote it. Are you sure that I wrote this, right? It's like, why is a bird there? Well, I'm just going to ignore the fact that there's a bird there. So the conversation between Papa and Mackenzie continues, and suddenly Papa goes, "You see this bird?" And out comes a theological concept that I'd never thought about. In a way that I'd never thought about it. The self-limitation of God, right? The fact that the bird is created to fly. Mackenzie, you were created to live loved. But sometimes pain is a way of clipping your wings, and you forget you were ever created to fly. You're looking through the little knothole of your pain, and you're defining the whole world through this one little thing, right? So that kind of stuff happened. And, wrote the got it done for Christmas, made the 15 copies, went back to work, 6 to the kids. Kim and I kept one, and my friends got the rest of them. And it took a while for the kids, because, you give a book to your kids for Christmas. It's like, thanks, Dad, just what we wanted. Yeah, it's like, we'll get right on that, How do you turn it on? Yeah, and it's, yeah. Where do you put the batteries in this thing? Yeah. So it took them a while, but my friends read it and immediately started sending it to their friends. In fact, my friends came and said, can we get more copies? So we went down to Office Depot and made 15 more copies, put a little collection together and made 15 more so that they could give it to their friends. I start getting emails from friends of friends, people that I don't know, and the emails are like mind-blowing. They are like, I would like to tell you how your book has radically affected our family or our situation, because you know what? We live in a world surrounded by great sadness. We just do. And because of those emails, I sent an email to an author that I had met. I only knew one author in my life at this point, and I knew him because he needed a driver one day, and I drove him around for like 6.5 hours. So he's like a for real author. And I'm going like, I wonder how you answer these emails. How do you do it? So I attached electronic version, not for him to read it, but just to him get a sense of, I wrote this thing, I'm getting these emails. For example, here's one, how do you answer these? And, or do you, or what? And he writes back a nice email and says, I get asked to read books a lot. Yeah?
Sorry, man.
Yeah, I know. And, but we do. And on this side of the whole, yes, I'm 1,000 behind. Okay, but he says, I'll try to get to it in about 6 months. And I'm going like, just tell me about the emails. Well, that's on a Friday night. On Monday, he calls me, which he had never called me on the phone. And he calls me and he says, what were you thinking sending me that manuscript? Now, I got enough shame in my history. When somebody raises their voice at all, I think I must have done something terribly wrong and I should probably go straight to prison. And so I just said, I had this reaction to what he said. It triggered me, right? So I go, throw it out. I said, don't read it. Just throw it out. Because I have no clue, right? He goes, no, you don't understand. I can't print the pages fast enough. What? He goes, I don't remember reading something in the last 15 years where my first thought is, I have 10, 15 friends I need to send this to like right now. I said, I'll send it to whoever you want. He said, I already did. And 2 of them turned out to be guys, and the 3 his friends, and the 3 of them had already had a conversation about this could become a movie. Okay, so right from the very beginning, I'm cleaning toilets and shipping out soldering tips, and now they're talking about it becoming a movie. It's like, for real? And you have to understand, at this time in my life, I'm finally living inside the grace of the day. I get to be the child. So none of this, I have 15 copies did everything I wanted this book to do. Like, seriously. And all of this is just interesting. Well, that's interesting. That's kind of funny. And so I had no expectations. So now they're going like, let's talk. So they fly me down. I flew down to LA, right? And we sat for 2 days with sticky notes all over the wall looking at the arc of the storyline. And they say, you know what? We should probably put it into print first for mass market, because here's the rule. If you can sell 100,000 copies, Hollywood will come talk to you about a movie. Now, they didn't tell me it's because it's so rare. They didn't say that part. They just said, if you can sell 100,000 copies of a novel, Hollywood will come talk to you about a movie. Well, I'm thinking, Portland has more than 100,000 people. How hard can that be? Because I don't understand at that time publishing or the movie industry or nothing, right? So it's like, really? So how hard can that be? So what they didn't tell me, and I learned over the next couple of years, is that the average book only sells 3,000 to 5,000 copies its entire existence. And if you can sell a novel 7,500 copies, you can legitimately put bestseller on your novel. 7,500. You could actually do it at 5,000, but that's right on the edge. But if you can sell 7,500, you can legit put bestseller on there. And but I don't know any of that, you know. So I'm thinking like, okay. So we get it ready over a course of about a year and a half. We found artists who did the cover, and we found, you know, one of the guys, the author guy, he typeset it so that it would fit, and then one of the guys created a little thing to send to the publishers, you know, as a whatever they do to try to sell it to the publisher, and we sent it to 26 publishers. Half of them were Christian faith-based publishers who I was hoping would not pick it up, and the other half were secular mainstream press, and I was hoping they would pick it up. And I just felt like, Christian and art, nonfiction, that's okay, but fiction, not so good. You have to be dead. And, you know, and Lewis and Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers, we do have Madeleine L'Engle, and we do have Marilyn Robinson, and so there's, you know, there's a few, but it's like, well, I didn't have to worry. Nobody wanted it, which was fine. I didn't have any expectations. Like, I'm not disappointed. Nobody wanted it. And I go like, what's the issue here? Well, the issue with both of them was they didn't know what genre it was. They didn't know whether it was self-help or if it was murder mystery or if it was theology. They couldn't figure out where to put it in a store. That was an issue that they had in common. But the faith-based people thought it was too edgy, and the secular people thought it had too much Jesus in it. So I was stuck between edgy and Jesus. And you see, when you're a publisher, you only do what you've done in the past. It's very hard for a publisher to take risks, you know. And so they didn't realize that there are millions of people in the world stuck between edgy and Jesus. They just didn't. They didn't.
Including Jesus.
Including Jesus. Yeah, including Jesus. So here we are, and it's like, I asked, well, how hard is it to publish a book? Well, two of the guys, of the three that wanted to turn it into a movie, two of them had been thinking about starting their own publishing house to do some of their own stuff. And now they had an opportunity. I was like, oh. So they filed papers with the state of California and created a publishing house. And so suddenly, like that, I had a publisher who would publish my books. Of course, it's the two guys. And so it's like, so now what? Well, we need a printer. So we found a printer near one of the guys' houses. So it was the closest one because that way he could ship books out of his house at night. He volunteered to do that because during the day he's putting in people's sprinkler systems into their yards. And so at night he could ship books out, you know. And so that was the thing. So now it's like, all right, we get the printer. How many do we order? Oh, I don't know. We take a look at their schedule of charges. You get a big price break if you order 10,000 copies. We were told later, you know, that's 8,000 in your garage after you've run out of friends and family and you have nobody left to give them away to. Yeah. So I didn't know. We ordered 10,000 copies. I had a buddy in Oregon who loaned me my first third of the first print run. And one of the guys had a savings and the other one had a Visa and a MasterCard. And we ordered 10,000 copies, and in May of 2007, the first shipment of the shack landed in the guy's garage. Actually, they sent 11,000 copies, and we found out there's a word called overage. They're allowed to accidentally print an extra 10% and charge you for them. Yeah, it's like, what a racket. Yeah, you know about that. So now we have 11,000 copies in a garage. No marketing, no distribution, nobody knows we exist, but we're smart enough to put the website where they can get the book at the back of the book.
Oh my gosh. Are you serious?
Totally serious. The only place you could buy the book was off the website, but the only place you could find the website address was at the back of the book. We are brilliant, let me tell you. So now we gave a bunch away. We gave a whole bunch away. And our goal was to get through 11,000 copies in 2 years. And then in 5 years, work our way to 100,000, and then Hollywood will come talk to the guys about a movie. That was the big picture. So I'm back up in Oregon. The books landed in May. June, July, middle of August, I get a call from California. Hey, Paul, we need to order more books. Did we give them all away? Like, I have no idea what's going on. And he said, no. He says, it's a crazy thing. People, they buy one off the website. They found it, however they found it. And then they come back 2 weeks later, and then they buy 5. And then 2 weeks later, they come back and they buy cases. Really? Well, and I was experiencing some of this because I ordered a whole bunch of cases from California. and I was dealing them like dope out of the back of a warehouse that I was working at, right? People would drive up and I'd exchange them a box and they'd give me money. It was like, I know, yeah. People would call me up, can I get a box of books? And I go, yeah, I'll meet. Where do you want to meet? How about on the freeway? So we'd stop and pull over and flash our lights, and we're exchanging money for a box, and people driving by going like, should we call 911 or what, And then I get a call from a cop, and he goes, can I meet you for coffee? So I said, sure. So we meet at St. Arbuck's? Yes. Yeah, St. Arbuck's, yeah. And so it's in the middle, it's in the middle of a St. Arbuck's, a patron saint of staying awake in church. Yes. So we meet at the St. Arbuck's in the middle of this shopping complex, right? And at the end of our coffee time together, he says, because he's telling me how the book had impacted his life, he says, hey, can I buy a box of books? I said, sure. So he drives his cruiser. He's in full gear, drives his cruiser, parks it right behind mine in the middle of the parking lot, right, blocking traffic. I'm handing him a box of books and he's paying me money. I'm thinking this is law and grace, like right here, right in the middle of the world. So great. So this is happening. So I say, well, how many should we order? I don't know. We ordered 20,000 and they delivered 22,000. And overage, And the 22,000 books land in the garage the day we have one case of books left from the first print run. So now we're supply chain experts. We're experts in supply chain management, right? We go through 22,000 copies in 60 days. We order 30,000 and we go through 33,000 copies in 30 days, right? And it's like, you're doing all the shipping? They're doing it. Nicholas moves down from, one of our sons, moves down to California to help ship. And the guy who was putting in sprinkler systems doesn't. He starts shipping. And so all the logistics are happening out of a garage, 2 storage units, and the local printer. And so now it's like, I'm thinking, why doesn't everybody do this? And we're getting calls from Barnes & Noble, and we're getting Barnes & Nobles, because people are showing up at their stores, Christian Supply and all this, and asking for the shack, and they look it up and say, doesn't exist, And then they say, well, it's with this publisher. Doesn't exist. And it's like, except there was a book by Mulholland called The Shack in Amazon's archives that got a huge boost during this time. And it's not a nice book. Okay? Not a nice book. And so I know someone out there is like, I can't believe Millie recommended me this book, So it starts to, Barnes & Nobles calls us, they finally backtracked to the website and then found a number and all that, called us and said, hey, we're really excited about your little book. Could you send us your marketing and promotion plan so we can get on board? And we said, do you have one that we could cut and paste that you could send us, And it's like, he hangs up, like laughs and hangs up. Well, 2 weeks later, they call back and they say, hey, normally, and a lot of our conversation started with the word normally, we charge a lot of money. It's like $30,000 to $50,000 a month He says, we charge a lot of money, it's called placement, to put publishers' books at the front of our stores nationwide. Would you consider allowing us to do this for you for 3 months for free? Let me pray and fast about that one. Yeah, no. Quickest fast I've ever had. Lasted about 4 seconds. And yeah, sure, yeah. So they did. By Christmas, we were number 1 in all books on Amazon. At the end of 13 months, from May of 07 to the end of June of 08, which marks a line, because that's when the 2 guys who own the publishing house enter a joint venture with Hachette, who takes the book internationally, right? But in those 13 months, we spend less than $300 in marketing and advertising and shipped almost 1.1 million copies of The Shack, right? I mean, I told you we're brilliant. It was such a God thing from the very get-go. And the book just goes out and starts creating explosions all over the planet. It becomes number 2 in the history of Brazil. Croatia adopts it as their book of the decade, and the Ministry of Culture calls and says, will you come talk to the country? So this ripple effect just starts to happen, becomes this massive hit in South Korea and in Germany and in the UK, and then it just keeps rippling out. So it ends up in 50 languages. And so and then the stories keep piling in, where people write me, let me tell you what happened. And it starts getting into prisons and gets into death row in Tennessee. And
you're going to tell us about the cave. Sophia and the cave.
Yeah, that's where I'm going right now. That's where I'm going. And he reads the cave chapter. Right? He does. That's exactly where I was going. And Terry reads it. And Terry says to me as I'm sitting next to him, here's what changed everything for me. I have lived all these years, and he said, I admitted what I had done, but I had never owned what I had done. I never owned it. I admitted it, but I never really faced it. And he said, here's the reason, is because I still, even though I'm on death row for the killing of one of God's precious children, I didn't deal with it because I still sat in the seat of judgment. That is, at least I wasn't as bad as the pedophiles on death row. And because I judged the pedophiles on death row, I didn't have to own what I had done. I was better than somebody. And he said, that scene absolutely exposed me. He said, I literally felt like I had no clothes on and was burning up with fire. And I'm literally crawling on the floor of my cell trying to get out of my own skin because the conviction was so deep and so intense. He said, that changed my whole life. And Terry now calls people on the outside trying to find people who will come visit the pedophiles on death row because some of them have not had a visitor in decades. And so the sitting in the seat of judgment where you judge God and you judge somebody else was what had kept him because of self-righteousness. Here you've got a guy on death row who's self-righteous because he feels like he's better than them, right? And had created this division between us and them. And now this tore him apart. And as a result of that, he then started not just owning it, but started to try to build some reconciliation. And there's some wild, crazy stories that he was involved in. About a year later, I was back in visiting Terry, and we had a chance to sit around in the library on death row. They have the table of reconciliation. And there were about 12 inmates and 3 of us from outside. And for almost 3.5 hours, all we did is told our stories and cried a lot. And I was blown away by how much they loved Jesus and how much they loved each other and how free they were. And since that time, 3 of those men have been executed. And they, when one of these guys is executed, there's this process they go through amongst the inmates where he gives whatever little few things he owns as gifts to those that he loves. I mean, it's horrific and beautiful. It's tragic and incredible, right? And we sit at this table, and Abu is one of the guys there. Abu had become a Muslim, and then through Islam had found Jesus, the Messiah, and was now a follower of Jesus. And he's an African American. He's in his early 70s. He has a death date now, April next year. And Abu, we're sitting there at the table, and at the end of this time, we have this, we stand up and hold hands, and the 3 of us from outside are wise enough to keep our mouths shut and listen to these men pray. And then Abu sings Amazing Grace in this deep African American, and it's just like, takes me apart. And about a month ago, I was in Tennessee speaking at a big Catholic church, and about 20 minutes into it, David, my friend David, hands me a phone, and it's Terry on death row who's called in, and he has 30 minutes, and we talk. I ask him questions, and he talks. There was like 600 people there at this event, and he tells his story. He tells some of the reconciliation process that's happened with particularly a woman who was really good friends with the young man that he killed. And this woman had been nudged by the Holy Spirit and had contacted him and said, I'm not here I'm not here to forgive you. That's not why I'm calling. The Lord has told me that I need to forgive you on behalf of the young man because he wants you to know that he forgives you, right? And that just tore him up. And then in that conversation with this woman at the end of about 25 minutes, real close to when he had to hang up, she says, and there's something that I want to say. And he's like, yeah? And she finally says, I want you to know that I love you. Right? She actually moved in order to be closer to help the guys on death row, this woman, and they become friends. So Terry is talking about all these things, and I'm watching the room, and I'm watching how one of the most categories of us, them, those guys on death row. I watch Terry humanize everyone on death row, and nobody left that room the same. They could not just create a category and execute it, just like it was that easy. And so, we're working on stuff. We're working on seeing if there's a way. There's a new governor who is a Jesus follower, but he's probably a little more Moses than Jesus. And that's my people. We tend to follow Moses. We say Jesus, but we really mean Moses. And because Jesus is about loving your enemy and stuff, who wants to do that? So, we'd rather have eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth kind of God, if it's in our best interests. So there's all this stuff that's going on right now, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. And Terry doesn't have a date yet, but anticipates that he will. The last man that was just executed, and Don, one of the kindest. These guys own what they did, right? They do, and they have done the work to change over time, and their love for each other and for Jesus is obvious and compelling, and here I write a story for my kids that allows me to be on that kind of holy ground. And Terry knows, and Abu knows, and the guys, they know that if they want me there at an execution, I'll be there. I'm not excited about it, but I'll be there. And it's holy ground. It really is. So that's, part of the weaving that's going on and the ripple effect of stories. I just also know that God is a redeeming genius. And that, I live inside the grace of the day doing what's right in front of me, knowing that the ripple effect of that, and in your lives, everything you do matters. Every choice you make about forgiving matters. About telling the truth rather than lying. About letting your secrets out rather than keeping them hoarded up. About letting someone into your life. All of those things matter. And we don't know how the ripple effect is. That's not our job. We don't make these choices based on outcomes. We make them because they're right and they're good and they're part of the beautiful thing that God is doing. So that gives you a little bit of an overview and a little piece of what's going on and some of the work that I'm doing. I'm actually working on 2 books right now. One of them is a nonfiction, The Art of Living in One Day's Grace. That's trying to bring together this whole idea of how to just stay inside the grace of one day. Because I think that's how we're designed to live. And then the fiction is a sequel for The Shack, which I never thought that I would write until I met the guys on death row. Because I have a serial killer. And now I've got a way to weave that into a story form. So we'll see where that goes. And if I can do it, there's a way that I want to do it that might have an impact in terms of what's happening with the executions. It's just timing, and we'll see. We'll see. So that's kind of what's on my heart right now. Thank you for this time, and we'll go to the panel at this point.